All right, hey, how we doing out there, guys? So, welcome back to another episode of the Bastion Black Performance Podcast. So, currently it is Wednesday, May the 25th at approximately 18:45 p.m. I believe it's actually 18:47. So, let's talk a little bit about what's going on in Ukraine right now. So, like I said, the last few weeks or so, there hasn't been nearly as much of the exciting stuff that was kind of going on the first, several weeks of the war, as far as like lots of dynamic positional shifts and things like that. So, kind of a lot of things that we're talking about are going to be a little bit more repeats of things that we've kind of talked about before. But also, like, this tends to be the nature of warfare, especially in the maneuver warfare, the kind of the mechanized warfare era, which is there tends to be periods where there's massive counterattacks and lots of extreme fighting going on, and then significant lulls between that for a couple of obvious reasons, which is one, obviously you have to build up your force and stuff when you're going to make major offensive um, moves and things like that. And then obviously once those kind of peter out, then there becomes a sort of a stabilization phase and another building up or a potential shifting or moving around of things that are going on. It's just kind of obvious, and we're kind of in that phase right now where Russia has more or less kind of lost the super dynamic part of the war, and now we're getting more into the positional stuff. So we talked about that last time. So again, last time we talked about how Ukraine had done some counterattacks around Kharkov here, Kharkiv, and had relieved the actual. I mean, the city itself was never completely surrounded, but had completely basically severed that section off. We talked about how there was a lot of fighting still going on in Luhansk and Donetsk down here, and how so we got the town of Izium, which kind of sits right around here, and how the Russians were still fighting to keep that corridor open. So we'll flash back to our maps here. So we can kind of see what we're doing here. So again, it's like we said, the Ukrainians have fully, removed the Russians from around Kharkov here. And so the Russians still control this highway kind of coming through Izium. If you actually look now at what their actual, their supply lines, the lines of communication, it does not include this highway and this ring road that kind of comes around Kharkov like it did now. It's primarily kind of this highway system that sort of comes down, through Vovchansk, coming from Belgorod, and takes some of these smaller roads that comes down and works its way towards Izium, which in and of itself is a good thing, if you're the Ukrainians, being able to take away a major highway system. But as it sits right now, we'll flash back again here. So the Ukrainians have not been able to sever this area, which is where those highways run through. So the Russians are still able to supply using Belgorod kind of as a hub and supply down through kind of this area to get down to Izium and down towards Kramatorsk and those things along this highway corridor. So, like I said, in last episode is we kind of didn't know what the Ukrainians would or wouldn't do as far as major counteroffensive stuff, and it doesn't really appear that they've done any particularly major counteroffensive actions, kind of in the east, which is not really particularly surprising. I mean, one, obviously they're still under pressure in multiple areas. They do still have to defend the border areas here, because the Russians obviously still have a presence on the border, and there has been fighting. Apparently like some kind of border skirmishes around Sumy that I read about last week. And so obviously they can't just take everybody away from there and be like, all right, cool, you're going to go in the south, you're going in the east and fight. They still do have to defend that, for obvious reasons. But the other thing that we kind of have to think about here is that, and this is why, I was wondering, and I didn't really want to make any like guesses or, as to what the Ukrainians would try to do from a counteroffensive standpoint, because we assume they'd have to go on the counteroffensive in some way. But the Ukrainians have been lucky, you could kind of say, like, during this, in that they've primarily been on the, I mean, they've been entirely on the defensive from a strategic standpoint. They've done some tactical and some operational level, counteroffensive, mostly somewhat like smaller scale, but being on the defensive means that, one, they have the advantage of terrain. They have the advantage of their lines of communication and general smaller lines, what we call interior lines. And so I brought this up way back in like my first episode or something like that. So I'll speak in general terms here. So if you're the Russians and you're kind of, so you're kind of dealing around Kharkov here, in the highway system here, you're over here, around Donetsk and everything. And so you think about like linear distance, like this is a long, long ways, right? Well, if you're the Ukrainians, you're in here, right? So that's what we would call interior lines, which means that they can very, roughly speaking, they can easily move units from, say, here to here, or from here to here, or from back closer to Kiev over to here. Whereas the Russians, let's say, especially when they still had their five axes, let's say they had elements around here and maybe they had a particularly potent element and they're like, hey, they're up here coming towards Kiev. It'd be really nice to have them in the east. Well, look, now they have to go all the way around to over here. Like that is a long distance. And one, obviously, it's dependent on the highway systems or the rail systems or whatever for transport. So the Ukrainians have been able to make good usage of that. And being on the defensive means that, obviously they tend to have the Russians much more exposed than they are. Because obviously, we typically historically talk about how when conducting offensive operations, you need to have a minimum of a 3-to-1 advantage in the area where you're attacking. Obviously, that doesn't mean that you have to outnumber the enemy 3-to-1 everywhere, but whatever the area it is that you're going to attack, you need to outnumber the defenders, by a 3-to-1 ratio, because obviously you have to leave your prepared defenses, your prepared positions, and things like that, in order to attack the enemy, which means you're going to be more exposed. And then obviously once an enemy's had time to prepare defenses, and whether they're particularly, like large scale defenses or not, they're going to be effective, especially in the early stages, because they're going to register artillery, which means they're going to shoot artillery at places where they think that they're going to run into people, later on. So they'll be like, oh, hey, this looks like an area where, they're going to move tanks later. So they'll pre-register that. So now when they eventually find the enemy there, they can go, hey, call up target XYZ 157, and they can put rounds on that immediately. Same thing with your machine guns and stuff like that. You'll set up machine guns so that you've got a particular field of fire, and you'll make sure that you can cover an area you want to cover. And sometimes it also includes terrain manipulation as far as like knocking down trees, moving things, potentially even flattening, like small hills and things to create better fields of fire, or building up, superior positions for yourself and removing it from the enemy. So Ukraine's been able to benefit from that. And without having to go on particular large scale offensives, I think they've been able to avoid a lot of Russian firepower in general. Now, if and when they decide to go on some sort of major counterattack in the east here, that's going to be kind of a different story. So you got to remember that the Russians have been in this area for years now, like going back to 2014. One of the reasons why the battle in Mariupol was such a big deal was Azov Battalion had captured that several years back, from the separatists, from the Russians, and that was one of the reasons why they held on to it so vigorously. Was because that was something they had already lost once before. So there's been reports, and I would just surmise also that the Russians, have been digging in, especially these areas that are kind of along, their lines of communication, their routes of supply here. So if the Ukrainians do decide to conduct, like large scale or at least relatively large scale operational counteroffensives, then that's potentially very dangerous. Because like I said, it's now that you're starting to leave the sort of the safety of the defense. That's when you tend to incur a lot of your casualties, not only in men but also in vehicles and equipment. And one thing we have to keep in mind with Ukraine is while they are getting a lot of Western assistance and things like that, if we kind of just keep in mind that one, the Black Sea area represents most of the industrial base of Ukraine, as well as most of the way that they get their grain out of Ukraine and out into the open market. Aside from the things that they can obviously just send to, neighboring countries or whatever. Well, with the Russians controlling their access to the Black Sea there, now they're going to start to kind of slowly, at least from an economic standpoint, going to kind of start to drown a little bit on that, start to starve, a little bit on things like that, whether they're actually starving or not. But, as far as being limited in what they can do economically, so they're going to start to be more and more reliant, completely on assistance from the West. So that'll kind of start to play out more as things go, as things kind of, continue to move along there. But now, so we also kind of think about, what the Russians are doing. So you see a lot of chatter, like, in the Russian parts of the internet and things like that. They talk about like, oh, this cauldron here and that cauldron there and stuff like that. And I'll be honest, a lot of it's kind of like, Russian, bot farm related things like that. So it appears that the Russians, initially there was a major attempt to kind of close off what could be considered a large encirclement, a large cauldron here. And it appears that they stopped, that effort because it wasn't working for them. But they've gone with multiple smaller ones. And so there's kind of a couple here. So I'll flash back over to the map so we can see where that's at in real time. So in Luhansk and Donetsk here. So where those are kind of centered around, is so you have a few of them here. So you have Severodonetsk and Rubizhne right here. So there's been a lot of major fighting there, and you guys have heard that in the news lately. One of the reasons why is because the Seversky Donetsk River here, and so there's a couple times the Russians tried to make major crossings of that and got absolutely slaughtered by pre-registered Ukrainian artillery and things like that. Also, Lysychansk here. That's kind of a hard word to say, Lysychansk. But so there's been a lot of fighting, kind of in this area, as far as like them attempting to make small pockets, or close off small pockets around Ukrainians. Also, as we kind of come back down into here, so we talked about, Popasna and working towards Bakhmut. So the Russians have been trying to close that off. So as we kind of talked, let me pull out just a little bit here. So we got Izium here and Kramatorsk here. So if you look at, so we know that they've been a lot of fighting around Kadivka here, and that they did, manage to take Popasna. And so there's a good video, you guys probably saw it, of like the Wagner mercenaries, kind of assaulting some buildings occupied by Ukrainians there. But so as you see, as they're trying to link up to Bakhmut here, that's going to allow them to potentially, kind of do a couple of small scale, encirclements around here. So if we see where we're at in relation to the city of Donetsk here, so that's this area right there that we're talking about. Let me go back in here. There you go. So we're talking about this area right here. So being able to kind of, slowly work these these little pockets out, for them is going to potentially give them the opportunity to kind of expand a little bit, attrit or otherwise wear down some Ukrainian forces. But also, if they can kind of start to make this more of a solidified, line, because as you see right now, the way it's set up is kind of a bit of a salient into the into the Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast here. And so salients, are dangerous for a couple of reasons. One, they're a little bit dangerous for everyone. So if you're the Russians, so we'll kind of look at where we're at right here, and then we'll kind of I'll flash back. So we're talking about, this is the Izium Kramatorsk kind of area right here, and so we'll flash over to our map here. So we're talking about that, and then coming down the highway here, more along Mariupol. There we go. So we're talking about the salient that kind of works its way through about right there, right? So what that means is that elements of the Russians that are here and elements of the Russians that are here can't directly support each other because they have this big protrusion into their line, i.e., so for example, let's say you have units here. Well, they obviously cannot just directly travel and move supplies or otherwise go to here. So that means that their route of travel, their route of supply is all the way around here. And we talked about, again, this, interior lines, whereas if the Ukrainians, technically speaking, what that means is you can have elements here and they're able to kind of respond to this area, respond to this area, respond to this area. So it gives them a chance to kind of, to play a little bit better defense there. Now, if you're the Ukrainians, the danger of that is obviously quite obvious. If the Russians were able to force a major penetration, along this north-south axis here, they could cut this off. And it also means that they can attack it from the north, from the east, from the south. So it can be attacked from 3 different directions. And obviously, if it could be cut off, then, they could create a sizable cauldron there that they could then, squeeze out, in whatever method they deemed necessary there. So, obviously, salients are opportunities for both sides, depending on how one approaches it. And so, like I said, it seems that the Russians are doing primarily kind of positional warfare in these areas, kind of trying to make some small pockets. As you can see, the Ukrainians have been kind of doing some small-scale counterattacks in other places. So we kind of get over by Mykolaiv and Kherson. So the Ukrainians have been active in Kherson. So I'll be honest, like, when I kind of read about this, it's hard for me to get a really good feel as what's going on, because apparently there's like active like substantial Ukrainian elements in Kherson. So there must be somewhat of a fluid front line here, and they're able to kind of, either penetrate or have forces kind of working in the area around Kherson. And so we'll kind of flash back out so we remember why that's important, right? So Mykolaiv here, which is back now under Ukrainian control, and then the front line runs kind of roughly it's up to here, like it sort of just peaks out from Kherson. But obviously Kherson sits right aside the lower Dnieper here, and so obviously it's a major crossing. But again, the Ukrainians being able to, if they can take that back, obviously they can trap Russians on this side, but also they can take it back. Now they gain an additional defensive barrier in order to try to keep them closer to the, what we consider the bridgehead here, in Crimea. And so obviously if they have any hopes of pushing them back into Crimea and back across the Kerch, they're going to have to kind of take some of those. Whereas conversely, if the Russians are able to hold on to Kherson and other, comparable small towns like, Nova Kakhovka here, they're able to use that as a barrier. So at the very least, you can kind of had some holding operations. So now obviously they've been active, up and around, Zaporizhia, Dnieper City, Nikopol here has been, has been the site of a decent amount of fighting. So that's where Nikopol is this kind of area right here. So Ukrainians been launching some local counterattacks. And Zaporizhia, if you remember, was where they had the Russians kind of assaulted a nuclear power plant there, like several weeks ago. And now they're kind of pulled back from there formally to kind of establish their lines. So, kind of, a couple, I guess, kind of starting to think a little bit more, of opinion and sort of like, me trying to extrapolate things that I can see in videos is, it kind of appears that the Russians have been a little bit more active in the air lately, but you have to be careful, getting a false positive, because it can also just be that now we have more access, or, there's been more videos of such put out. So it's possible. It doesn't actually mean they've been any more active. There's been a dump of videos coming out. I have seen a lot of videos of Russian close air doing work in the east. So obviously around the separatist areas. In particular, a lot of their rotary wing stuff. But now, one thing I do think is telling from that is, so when you see the rotary wing, you see a lot of videos of them doing, firing what we call their forward firing aerial rockets. So kind of their unguided rockets. And so what you see a lot of the videos, and a lot of them are like first person, like cockpit videos, is they're kind of flying level to the horizon, and then they'll put the nose way up, launch their rockets off at a severe angle, and then they'll kind of peel off and come back. And so, one, obviously they're trying to increase the range of their forward firing rockets that way. But one thing it kind of tells me is that, so one, unguided aerial rockets are not very accurate at all. Like the purpose that they serve is kind of area saturation, what you could kind of consider like light artillery. Like in a way, it kind of serves a very similar role to what like automatic grenade launchers serve on the ground. Like, for us, like the Mark 19 and things like that. So the actual explosive warhead in them is not particularly big. And like I said, they're not particularly accurate. But, if you're a helicopter and you wanted to do a quick area saturation, you can do a quick launch of several, of a couple dozen or several dozen, unguided rockets, across an area, and then peel off rather quickly. Whereas comparatively, the other weapons that they're armed with, so one, say like an auto cannon, like the Apache and like the Mi-24 and 35 and other things have, is that's a particularly accurate weapon. Obviously, it's a direct fire weapon. It has long range. It's not super great for strictly area saturation, just because its rate of fire is not really high, and because it's a direct fire weapon, it means it kind of has to be used a little bit differently. Whereas obviously with rockets, you're able to fire multiple rockets essentially all at the same time. So you could kind of pick a small area. I don't know what you want to call it. You call it a football field. So you'd be like, hey, we're going to land these in a football field area as we're coming through. Obviously flying, forward, you could nose down, hit that, peel off, and you could saturate that relatively, instantly, as from the standpoint of the helicopter. Whereas if you're going to prosecute the same thing with the autocannon, you'd either have to make multiple, like numerous passes in order to get that level of saturation, or you'd have to be in a loiter, in a hover mode, and then you'd have to work it, back and forth with the cannon. And then obviously the other typical weapon is the guided missile. which are obviously much higher in accuracy, typically much higher in total damage, but they're not an area saturation weapon. You use them specifically to pick out specific vehicles or specific enemy hardpoints, buildings, things like that. So, one thing that kind of tells me, excuse me, is that if that's the way that they're firing, one, you have an already inaccurate weapon system just in its nature, and the fact that they're firing them at an angle and trying to increase the range, I kind of, divine from that they are still very nervous to go over Ukrainian lines. So it appears that they're probably mostly firing from roughly within their own lines, or kind of the extent of areas that they're under control. They're able to fire these, and they can get a couple thousand meters worth of total distance off of that, and then kind of peel off and fall back. So what that kind of tells me is that the Ukrainians still have definitively effective counter air related assets. So especially shoulder fired surface to air missiles and things like that. The type of things that are very dangerous for rotary wing, because relatively speaking, rotary wing flies slower. They fly closer to the ground, so they're better targets for that. Whereas fixed wing stuff, they tend to, one, they're obviously much faster, but they also tend to operate from, higher levels, when they're prosecuting their targets. So I'm thinking that means that the Ukrainians still have very effective man pads, their surface to air capabilities in regards to that, in there. And I think, you're kind of starting to see an expansion. Now there's starting to be videos available of the Switchblade drones, which are, they call them kind of the kamikaze, the suicide drone. So the drone where you just literally fly the drone into the target versus like dropping something, which that'll kind of be interesting to see how that plays out here in the near future. There's still a lot of usage and a lot of videos out there of Ukrainians using drone dropped munitions to prosecute both troops and vehicles, which I think is very cool because I think it completely changes the game. Just because one, obviously, like, most of the payload delivery on those is pretty small, but obviously you can see in the videos that nobody knows that they're there. So that, they're using small, like the quadcopter, quad rotor types of drones and things like that to drop these small grenade sized munitions. And they're able to cause, a decent number of casualties with them. And I think in that regard, it serves, kind of a similar role to what the booby trap does. It's like what booby traps do is they kind of, one, they make you really hesitant to like pick things up and go into certain places and stuff like that. But they kind of keep you on edge because once you hit like a couple of, you pick up a couple of booby traps or whatever, it kind of makes you think that everything's booby trapped. And I think the kind of the drone dropped submunition serves a very comparable role, which is effective, which is that if you're a Russian and you're kind of getting accustomed to sitting in, your little trench, your little fighting position, or your little observation post or whatever, and now some dude comes and drops a grenade, and maybe it doesn't kill anybody, but maybe just like slightly, or maybe it causes moderate wounds on 2 or 3 guys. Well, now every single time that you're out in any position, you're going to think, hey, there might be a drone above, or damn it, this position could definitely be hit by a drone. Maybe I'll stay inside. So it's definitely going to have those lingering effects, on the troops when it comes to that. But you've also seen them, so they've been starting to drop like RKG, I think 1600 RKG3 types of grenades. So the RKG3, you guys have seen some videos probably from Iraq, but it's a handheld grenade that basically, so you kind of pull a pin and a little safety spoon comes off it, a drogue parachute comes out, and then it's a shape charge grenade meant for anti-armor work. And so they've been dropping those, and then a similar modified one from drones. And you've been seeing them take out like armored vehicles up to and including main battle tanks, T-72s and things like that, that's a huge game changer. The fact that you could have, some little freaking, 2 foot by 2 foot drone dropping a 3-pound grenade on top of a T-72 and knocking it out. That's an absolute game changer when it comes to those things. And then, kind of, I guess the last point I sort of wanted to talk on that was, you can kind of see it. Again, I like the Institute of Study of War. They typically have good maps. I just hate it because it's whenever you zoom in on it, you can't really move around and it sucks a little bit. But there's kind of some talking about like partisan activities, in and around this area, which is it's something I've been talking with guys at work about a lot, which is it's entirely possible that it's just because there's no videos and no reporting of it. But to me, it's one thing that makes a lot of the things that I see kind of suspicious is because it almost seems entirely that all of the fighting that's going on in Ukraine is being done by like formal military units. And while there were a lot of it, like funny videos of, people driving around and doing drive-bys with Molotovs and stuff kind of early in the war and things like that, there does not really appear to be much, or at least there doesn't appear to be like video and otherwise reporting of a lot of partisan or quote unquote guerrilla insurgent type of activity against the Russians, um, which I don't know what exactly that makes my opinion of it, but it does make a person question some things because obviously, the separatist element in the East, significant part of them are obviously Russian and as far as um, ethnicity and and pro Russia in general. So it kind of makes me wonder what the true underlying forces are, from the Ukraine versus the true underlying forces are from Russia. But I've been starting to see more videos come out of some Ukrainian partisan activities against Russians. As far as like, I've seen a couple of them where they're basically just like, lighting vehicles on fire, behind the lines and doing some other comparable things, blowing up some bridges and stuff, which would be classic, irregular warfare things that like, in the U.S. that would be things that like our SF guys would do, or it'd be like, tier 2 units like Marine Raiders and, the Army Rangers and SEALs and stuff like that would do. And so it kind of makes me wonder as well, with the drones being able to drop, these kind of, one, obviously the small submunitions, but also being able to drop realistically effective anti-armored grenades and stuff. It makes me wonder if that's also starts to really have a psychological effect as far as when paired with those kind of behind the lines operations, if it starts to make it seem like there are a lot more Ukrainians behind the lines, or conversely, if they're Ukrainians, obviously the Russians, must be doing some of that as well, is if it makes the Ukrainians feel like there are a lot more Russians behind the lines than there really are. So I think those are just kind of very interesting sort of modern developments, as far as weapons and things go. But again, kind of keep paying attention to this. As we know, Ukraine has gotten a lot of Western military equipment in here in the last couple of weeks, last few weeks. They're starting to be on the front line. And like I said last episode, Western artillery is fantastic. So they've been able to use things like guided artillery and stuff a lot. So you're going to start to see more of that come in. So like I said, kind of keep ear to the ground and see if we can't what it is that Ukraine decides to do with that. If they're going to kind of sit in their defense and just pick and peck at the Russians more here, or if they do have a particular counter stroke in mind that they plan to operate now that they have artillery that is both much longer ranging than Russian artillery, but significantly more accurate with certain munitions. But that's pretty much all I've got for the day. But remember, guys, only the hits count, and you can never miss fast enough to catch back up.